Welcome to Sharing Knowledge, presented by St. John's University. My name is Bobby Gempesaw, President of St. John's. Catholic, Vincentian, Metropolitan, and Global, St. John's currently enrolls more than 20,000 students. For 146 years, the university has fostered student success, and our graduates are uniquely prepared to meet the challenges of a global society. Join us today as we explore social justice and the presidential elections with our distinguished guests, Dr. Diane Heith, Professor and Department Chair of Government and Politics at St. John's University, and Dr. Aubrey Hendricks, Professor at Columbia University and expert commentator on the intersection of religion, politics, and social policy in America. It is no secret that this year's presidential election has dominated headlines and conversations. Equally as compelling has been the focus, or lack of, on issues ranging from the economy, healthcare, the environment, immigration, criminal justice, and education. We will discuss these topics and more today on Sharing Knowledge, presented by St. John's University. Diane and Aubrey, thank you for joining me today on Sharing Knowledge.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
When we enter into a conversation on social justice, it can go a number of different ways. So I suggest we start with a definition of social justice, its importance to the American public, and where it fits into our political system. So I'll start with you, Diane. Can you give us your definition on social justice and how you think these issues are addressed in our political discussions today?
Of course. When I think of social justice, I think of fairness and equity and equality. And the issues that I think about when I think about social justice are issues of poverty, issues of healthcare, issues of social welfare, in a sense. However, when I think about our political system, especially when I'm talking about teaching political science and teaching government, I'm usually focused on equality from a slightly different perspective. And when I think about it in terms of our political system and our history, there's a tension in how we look at issues of what we consider social justice versus how we talk about equality in our country because of the tension between the idea of community and individuality in our system, and that while we focus on community, particularly from our religious traditions, when we focus on it on equality in politics, it's very much individual, and it's focused on pulling yourself up from your bootstraps and being hard-won and focused on what your needs are. And so there's a rich tension in our history between those two issues. But I think that when we're trying to pull together what social justice means, it's about making sure that we're not losing people in our society, and that we're bringing all people in our society forward together on the march that we're taking.
Well, thank you. You know, as I reflect on your answer, there's a glaring statistic which reads that the top 1% of U.S. households control 40% of the nation's wealth. So, Aubrey, what are your thoughts and perspectives on the definition of social justice from a religious and social policy perspective? And how do these affect the current presidential races?
Well, justice in the biblical tradition, justice is the most often used term in the Hebrew Bible, meaning that it's one of the most important principles. We get our definition of justice, though, from the prophets, the period of the prophets, and that is egalitarian justice, that everyone has the right to eat of the tree of life. And we see Jesus reflects that in love your neighbor as yourself. And But what we see in this country, in our political landscape, is another kind of justice, definition of justice, libertarian justice, which is what was being alluded to, where freedom is the watchword, when the biblical watchword should be responsibility. It's individuality versus neighbor care, and so what we have is two different poles of the political system, which have quite a bit of impact on how policies are formulated.
So our politicians are our leaders in creating policy, but the American public doesn't really hear candidates use the term social justice in their political discussions and conversations. Why is that, Diane?
I think it has to do with both the way we run our politics, but also the beliefs in what we think matter to people when making their choices at the voting booth. And I think the current strain of politics that we're seeing today is very polarizing, very partisan, really focuses on a very us and versus them kind of strategy or approach, and that obviously does not have its center in a communitarian approach or a social justice approach of lifting all boats. It's very divisive, and as a result, on some level it works, and it appeals to certain groups, to especially in the 2016 campaign, there's been a lot of pointing to the anger in the electorate, and that anger can be traced to feelings of potentially being left behind. But rather than focusing again about bringing everyone together and trying to perhaps share the wealth better in our system through policy, instead it's much more about separating out those who are quote-unquote other and focusing on, what am I going to get? And that's a very divisive kind of politics, and doesn't deal with what we typically would look for in social justice kind of policy making.
Aubrey, do you care to comment?
Well, for one thing, we can hold America's feet to the fire in terms of the principles claimed to hold dear, and that extends to religious factions as well. And we have to increase folks' knowledge of the ethical content of our faith. Jesus really didn't bring any doctrines or dogma or orthodoxy. He essentially taught how people should act on this earth, replicating the kingdom of God. And his teachings were mostly ethical. And not only that, Jesus spoke about poverty more than any other subject other than God. If we raise these issues, just these small issues, that can make a difference in their perspective. I think what it really comes down to, that we really need much greater education in the basic ethics of the faith that most of us claim to believe in. And then, on the other hand, when it comes to the secular side, people have to be aware what it is that they're subscribing to. A lot of folk don't realize that subscribing to the right-wing libertarian approach is inconsistent with biblical ethics. Folks, their consciousness has to be raised so they can understand that. Now, if they don't want to go along with it, that's another question. But we have not substantially enough injected that into the political sphere.
We saw the difficulty of trying to bring that language or that focus into play when President Obama was fighting for health care. All the conversation about health care was about cost, it was about savings, it was about all sorts of financial issues for people who had health insurance. It wasn't until the end of the process that President Obama began bringing in the concept, the fact of how many people actually were without, and what kind of nation would we be if we were not helping people who needed health care get health care. And that conversation came much later because of this almost discomfort in having those conversations, and that's not something, again, that is traditionally in the sort of surface level politics that we're often fighting about, and it leads to the lack of knowledge, I think.
Yeah, I think this is an important case study. I was on an advisory, faith advisory to the Obama versus Obama campaign, and we noted that at the beginning he did say that that healthcare, passing a healthcare reform, was a responsibility of his faith, a function of his faith. But he jettisoned that very early and went to the secular side, which gives us some sense of how little faith politicians have in talking about faith.
Is this also related to the concept of political equality, where our elections are dominated by those who have the money?
Well, yeah, absolutely. We're talking about a hegemonic political order, hegemony, ideological domination, in an order that has made people think that the way things are is normative. And they have the resources to do that. They control all the entertainment and the news media. They are giving out misinformation, and I'm not just talking about outright lies of some of our candidates today, but they give out misinformation, and it's because they have the money and the resources to do that. We need to have a revamping of the system to sort of even the playing field. And we also need to talk about caps in our political, in our elections, so rich folks don't win because they're rich and by default.
Although in 2016, kind of this election that we've had this year has turned on its ear this idea that if you have the most money raised in your political action committees, that you're going to automatically win. We've seen candidate after candidate fall by the wayside unexpectedly, where you have these enormous amount of money fundraised by private groups being shut down by an outpouring of people voting. People voting will always change the outcome and affect whether or not money wins. Unfortunately, when money controls the message and people stay home and don't participate, money wins. But we still control the ballot box.
That's true. We control the ballot box. But when we talk about ideological domination, we talk about hegemony, the 1% is going to benefit no matter who is in office. And so, we have the votes, but look at how they can negate votes and obfuscate issues because they have these resources. So, absolutely, our political system is very much in thrall to those who are rich and who want to control it. And there's no question about that. It's very sad.
We will take a short break and be back with Sharing Knowledge. Welcome back to Sharing Knowledge. We're discussing today social justice and the presidential elections. Diane and Aubrey, the millennial generation is the largest generation in the country today, more than 83 million. A question I have is, how can this generation move from the online activism to join a cause and get involved in our presidential election to make a difference?
Traditionally, the way young people get involved is starting on college campuses, joining their college parties, whether Democratic Party, Republican Party, Libertarian Party, Green Party, whatever it is. They can often start that way and getting involved at the grassroots level, going around handing out flyers and things like that. Of course, in this generation where everything's online, the starting point for most of them is their phones and learning how to use that to connect with organizations and getting out and rallying. But one of the things about politics and having success in politics and making a mark on an issue is about participation, and you cannot participate just on the other end of your phone. It has to be out doing it and getting involved, and it's wonderful to see young people getting involved in their first campaigns and working for a candidate or for a group that's pushing a cause, and often that starts when they're in college and the work they're doing in their classes and bringing that to what they want to see their leaders do. And it's often the first time that they get activated leaves such an impression for the rest of their life that that's going to be the path that they end up on in terms of their voting habits. And so getting involved at 18, 19, 20 is wonderful for setting the stage for what you're going to do with your future.
Aubrey, it's been observed that the millennials vote based on personality instead of the beliefs. They're looking for a dreamer. Can you care to comment on that statement?
Well, yeah, I think that we who have come before them have to help to articulate a vision for them, something to work toward, something specific, not just change. I don't know that millennials are moved by personalities as much as our generation is moved by personalities. I think that young people, by and large, gravitate toward principles or vision, as I've said. This shows that the young people are much more open to new ideas and much more thoughtful, if you will, than some who have come before them.
But if you think about what influenced them, this is the generation that after 9/11 and the recession, these are the things that affected their views of politics and of politicians. And so it's not surprising, I think, from that perspective that they are looking for something different, because what they're looking back on has not been terribly successful from their perspective.
Yeah, so I'm going to go back, Aubrey, to one of the terms you used when we had a definition on social justice. You know, we have two major parties. One party espouse less government regulation and intervention, while another party support egalitarian justice, meaning equal access to resources. Is the current election process changing the attitudes of the public towards party?
I've not looked at polling extensively, but it seems like they're leaning more toward libertarian political philosophy, which, of course, is not about social responsibility. Essentially, what does it say? It's about enforcing contracts, keeping the peace within borders, and protecting the borders. It has nothing to do, and that's very small government. And so when you hear people talk about smaller government, and you see folk cleaving to that, they're supporting what I would say is a non-biblical stance, because the watchword of the Bible is social responsibility. And libertarianism, this small, well, let me say this, government, the Bible doesn't say anything about what size government should be. It just doesn't. But it does say what responsibilities those in power have for those who are weak, are poor, unempowered. So we can talk politically, but since I'm a biblical scholar, I will say this. The right wing, the basis of right-wing political philosophy, that includes their economic philosophy, is really not in line with biblical ethics. It's not in line with mishpat, justice, or sodakah, righteousness, or doing justice. On the left, it's not totally in line either. I mean, because, we're not saints, but there is a closer hewing to it, because egalitarian justice sees that everyone has a right to be all right, and that we have a responsibility to at least give everyone equal opportunity, not equal outcome, but at least equal opportunity.
So Diane, shifting the topic a little bit, you know, the political campaign today has been defined by ugly name-calling, insulting behavior that goes against our values and ideals. Can you care to comment whether our political parties have crossed that line of political decency?
It's not been a good year, I think. I think it's been very interesting to see both the backlash and the celebration for badly behaving politicians. I think it's not something we should be celebrating, but the fact that it's now in the culture becomes a problem. And I think, you know, you hear this, it's particularly with families with children. It is unusual, to say the least, to have to send your fourth grader out of the room when a presidential candidate is talking. Yeah. You should not have to do that. It should be just the
opposite.
Exactly. They should be able to listen, to participate, to understand, to see our democracy flourish. And instead, we don't have that at all. And I don't know that I would say, however, that it's party-wide or even across the system. I think, but when you have a single individual who's behaving differently and receiving success for that difference and that behavior, you see other.
The whole dynamic.
It changes everything, and whether or not we can swing that pendulum back the other way, one can only hope.
That's absolutely. Discourse has been coarsened. Civility has been thrown out of the window when it is shown that a politician can really appeal to hatred and demagoguery, can catch people's imagination by saying what a big shot he is and this, that, and the other. Other folk are going to take note of that. And this so far has been a successful, politically successful model, ethically and morally. It's a disaster. But we're going, so I won't mention his name, but this gentleman has changed the political dynamic by modeling that bad behavior, lies, saying horrible things about people, co-signing on beatings and alienation of people. They see that you can do that and not pay a high price.
We will take a short break and be back with Sharing Knowledge. Welcome back to Sharing Knowledge. Our topic today is social justice and the presidential elections. We have a number of students joining us here today, and we have a question from Kim Mangro, a senior here at St. John's.
Hi, Dr. Gempesaw. My question is, as a college student, how can I be more assertive in creating change in government attitudes towards the things that are most important to me?
We can ask either of our panelists to take that question.
I think my colleague articulated earlier. Get involved, as she was saying, in college organizations, but also get clear about what it is you really believe, and try to evolve a vision of the world that you want. That gives you more. Well, it gives you strength for one thing, and it also save a lot of legwork and some pain, very possibly.
We can take a question from another student. His name is Adrian Duran, who is a graduate student here at St. John's University.
So I guess my question would be, what would it take for both of these parties to put their differences aside and work with a presidential candidate to, I guess, make amends for these social justice issues?
Well, sitting here in this beautiful church, perhaps a miracle. I think it is, in our current political system, a lot to expect great change at the national level, unfortunately, unless something significant happens in this current election, which, given everything that's going on, it is very, very hard right now to predict what the outcome would be, whether or not we'd see change in the House and the Senate, as well as in the president, in terms of who's which party is controlling the top offices. But what I would say, sort of getting back to Kim's question as well, is starting at the grassroots and change at the local level, stuff percolates up, and that we can do so much, and so many things are happening at the state level from governors and from active city organizations, and we're so much more likely to see change there than we are at the national level. At the national level, I think we get change through voting, and obviously the more people who participate, and if people have different ideas and want those ideas to affect at the national level, the only way to do it is to participate and to vote.
I would like to thank Dr. Diane Heith and Dr. Aubrey Hendricks for joining us today for this timely discussion. The American public will choose a new president in November, and the president-elect will have to address key social justice issues during a historic time in our nation's history. I hope you have learned a little bit more about social justice and the presidential elections from a contemporary and historical viewpoint. Thank you for watching Sharing Knowledge. We will see you next time.
Of social welfare, in a sense. However, when I think about our political system, especially when I'm talking about teaching political science and teaching government, I'm usually focused on equality from a slightly different perspective. And when I think about it in terms of our political system and our history, there's a tension in how we look at issues of what we consider social justice versus how we talk about equality in our country, because of the tension between the idea of
discuss these topics and more today on Sharing Knowledge, presented by St. John's University. Diane and Aubrey, thank you for joining me today on Sharing Knowledge.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
When we enter into a conversation on social justice, it can go a number of different ways. So I suggest we start with a definition of social justice, its importance to the American public, and where it fits into our political system. So I'll start with you, Diane. Can you give us your definition on social justice and how you think these issues are addressed in our political discussions today?
Of course. When I think of social justice, I think of fairness and equity and equality. And the issues that I think about when I think about social justice are issues of poverty, issues of healthcare, issues.
Heith, Professor and Department Chair of Government and Politics at St. John's University, and Dr. Aubrey Hendricks, Professor at Columbia University and expert commentator on the intersection of religion, politics, and social policy in America. It is no secret that this year's presidential election has dominated headlines and conversations. Equally as compelling has been the focus, or lack of, on issues ranging from the economy, healthcare, the environment, immigration, criminal justice, and education. We will discuss. Welcome to Sharing Knowledge, presented by St. John's University. My name is Bobby Gempesaw, President of St. John's. Catholic, Vincentian, metropolitan, and global, St. John's currently enrolls more than 20,000 students. For 146 years, the university has fostered student success, and our graduates are uniquely prepared to meet the challenges of a global society. Join us today as we explore social justice and the presidential elections with our distinguished guests, Dr. Diane